In the middle of the silent desert, Johnny Depp leaned in and whispered something to Ibrahim Traoré. Moments later, Traore stood up and ordered everyone to leave the camp. The desert was quiet. Not the usual quiet, but the kind that makes your heart beat louder, like even nature is holding its breath. There was no sound, just wind, sand, and two men sitting under a worn-out tent. Johnny Depp sat on a simple wooden chair. No designer clothes, no sunglasses, just a black scarf around his neck and a heavy look on his face, like he hadn't slept in days. Across from him sat Ibrahim Traoré, calm, alert, but curious. He didn't know why Johnny had come all this way. No media, no security, no explanation. Just one message from his team earlier. He's here, alone, and he asked to speak to you directly. This wasn't a meeting between a celebrity and a president. This was something else, something that felt serious. The fire between them cracked softly. The sky above was turning deep blue as the sun faded behind the dunes. Traore waited. He knew better than to rush a man who looked like he was carrying something too heavy to say out loud. Finally, Johnny took a slow breath and spoke. You probably don't know me beyond the movies, but I've come here because there's something I can't keep inside anymore. His voice was calm, but his eyes were screaming. Pain, fear, guilt, everything was there. I heard stories about you, he continued, that you're not like the others, that you don't answer to the usual powers, and that when people speak the truth, you listen. Traore didn't respond. He simply gave a small nod, allowing him to go on. Johnny reached into his coat and pulled out a folded photo. He handed it to Traore with shaking hands. It was a picture of a small boy, around 6 or 7, laughing, eyes bright. The photo was old, a little torn. My son, Johnny said quietly. The world doesn't know he exists. I never wanted him in the spotlight. I kept him hidden to protect him from the world I was trapped in. Traore studied the picture, then looked back at him. Johnny looked down, breathing heavier now. They always say Hollywood is fake. That's not true. It's real, just not in the way people think. The power behind the scenes, the deals that never make the news, the rooms no one talks about, they're all real. And I was part of it. He paused, fighting his own voice. They didn't just use me, they owned me. And when I tried to leave, they reminded me who really controlled everything. Traore leaned slightly forward now. He wasn't just listening. He was locked in. They've reopened the room, Johnny said. The same room where they took things from us. Not money, not even our names. Something worse, our silence. The fire cracked again, louder this time. Traore's face turned serious. What kind of room? He asked. Johnny pulled out a small black USB drive and held it in his hand. This has footage. I wasn't supposed to have it. Someone I thought was gone mailed it to me a month ago. No, just the drive. He stared at it. I watched it. And after that, I couldn't sleep. Not because of what I saw, but because I remembered everything. Every detail, every face. And I realized they're going to do it again. This time, with bigger names. With more force. And maybe with my son. Traore sat back. His jaw tightened. Why are you telling me? Johnny looked straight at him now. Because you're the only one they haven't touched yet. Silence. Then, Johnny leaned in. He moved closer to Traore and whispered something in his ear. Just a few words. What he said, we'll never know. Not fully. But in that moment, Traore's expression changed. he didn't speak. He just stood up, fast. He looked toward the nearest soldier standing outside the tent and gave a sharp command. "Clear the camp." "Sir?" "Everyone. Now." The soldier nodded and disappeared into the shadows. Within minutes, the quiet camp became even quieter. Footsteps faded. Radios turned off. Even the wind seemed to hold back. Now, it was just the two of them again. One secret between them. One drive on the sand. And a fire that burned like something had just been awakened. Traore stood near the fire, his back to Johnny, staring into the dark desert. The flames flickered behind him, casting tall, dancing shadows on the tent walls. He didn't say a word. Johnny stayed seated, watching him closely. The USB drive still rested between them on the sand. Quiet, small, but somehow heavier than anything either of them had carried before. "Do you believe me?" Johnny finally asked, voice low. Traore didn't turn. He didn't need to. His voice came back calm, but sharper now. "I don't think you came all this way just to lie." He finally turned and walked back toward the fire. His eyes now held something different, a quiet storm building behind them. "That room you mentioned. Others have hinted at it. Whispers, accidents, people disappearing." He paused, then added, "But never proof." Johnny nodded. "They make sure of that. Most who see it either forget or disappear." Traore crouched down and picked up the USB. He held it between two fingers, staring at it for a few long seconds. "You understand what happens if this is real?" he said slowly. "I do," Johnny replied. "But if I say nothing, someone else will pay the price." Traore walked over to a small metal case near his chair and opened it. Inside was a secure field laptop, something only a handful of leaders would carry. He plugged in the USB and powered up the device. Johnny leaned forward. "You're going to watch it now?" Traore shook his head. "No, not here. Not in the open." He removed the drive immediately after confirming it worked. Then locked it inside a hidden compartment beneath the case. He looked at Johnny again. "What else haven't you told me?" Johnny looked down, quiet for a moment. His fingers dug lightly into his palms. "There's a name," he whispered. "Why?" Never thought I'd say out loud again. He was there, in that room, watching, smiling. And he's not just a man anymore. He's a symbol, a global one. Traore raised an eyebrow. "Give me the name." Johnny hesitated, not because he was unsure, but because saying it made it real. Then he said it. And even though the wind had picked up slightly and the fire cracked again, for a full 5 seconds, nothing else moved. Traore's face didn't show fear. It showed something else. "Recognition. You saw him there?" Traore asked. Johnny nodded slowly. "And I think he saw me." Traore stood up again. "This changes things." Johnny leaned forward, desperate now. "They won't stop, Ibrahim. I left everything. My work, my home, even my son. Because I knew they were watching me. I don't need protection. I need someone who won't play by their rules. Someone who can make them afraid." Again, Traore looked at him, and for the first time that night, his expression softened just slightly. "You think I can scare them?" "I think," Johnny said, "you already have." There was a long pause. Then Traore walked over to the tents, flap, and pulled it back. Outside, the night had deepened. The guards were now distant silhouettes. The desert stretched forever, quiet, wide, dangerous. He turned to Johnny. "You'll stay here tonight," he said, "in my tent. You don't leave until I say so." Johnny stood up slowly. "Are you going to expose them?" "Traore, looked at him with steady eyes. I'm going to do something worse. What's that? I'm going to make them speak. Johnny didn't say anything. He simply nodded, and finally sat back down as if something inside him had just let go. The desert, once silent, now felt like it was listening, because a war that was never supposed to reach the light had just begun to unfold in the middle of the night. The tent flap closed behind them. Inside, the fire had calmed, but outside, something darker was rising. Not in the sand, not in the sky, but in the silence that comes before a storm. Johnny sat still. For the first time, his hands had stopped shaking. Traore paced slowly now, not nervous, focused. His mind was moving through layers of possibility, danger, and strategy. He was no stranger to secrets, but this was different. This wasn't just about power. This was about the invisible hands behind it all. He turned to Johnny again. You said they reopened that room. Where? Johnny's face darkened. Geneva, beneath an old building that's supposed to be abandoned. It's private, off-grid, not on any satellite feed. But the people going in, they don't come back out the same. Traore raised an eyebrow. And your son? You said they might come for him? Johnny swallowed hard. Last week, someone left a toy outside his safe house. The exact one he used to carry when he was a baby. No note, no footprints, just left there in the open as a message. He paused, eyes burning now. That's why I ran. That's why I came here. Traore sat down across from him again. Do you know why they've waited until now? Johnny looked confused. What do you mean? They've had years to silence you. Why now? Why reopen that room? Why reach for your son now? Johnny thought for a moment, then said something he hadn't allowed himself to say until now. Because I'm no longer useful to them, and you're becoming a threat they can't ignore. Traore nodded. There's something you need to understand, he said slowly. They don't fear the truth. They fear what happens when someone they can't control starts telling it. He stood again, walked over to a metal container, and opened it. Inside were papers, but not ordinary ones. They were files with red stamps, blacked out lines, and photos that looked like they were taken from inside places no camera should have been. He pulled one out and handed it to Johnny. Johnny's face turned pale as he looked at it. That's him, he whispered. The photo showed a man, smiling, hand on someone's shoulder, standing at a table inside a large, dark room. Same room, same atmosphere, different victim. Traore said, this was sent to me 3 weeks ago from someone in New York. No name, just a burner phone and a simple message. You're next, if you don't stop asking questions. Johnny looked stunned. They're watching both of us. They've always been watching, Traore said. But now they know we're watching back. He took the photo back and locked it inside the case again. We don't move recklessly, he continued. We move precisely. They hide behind systems. But systems only work when people obey them. I've learned fear is their biggest weapon, but also their biggest weakness. Johnny leaned forward, his voice almost desperate now. Then tell me, what do we do next? Traore stared into the fire, then said quietly, I'm going to expose them. But not with press conferences or interviews. No headlines. No social. He turned to Johnny. I'm going to make their own people turn on them. Johnny blinked. How? Traore smiled faintly. The kind of smile that doesn't come from confidence, but from clarity. There are people still inside. People who've been waiting for a reason to speak. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope, sealed and marked only with a number, 0117. This is our first reason. Johnny looked at the envelope but didn't ask what was inside. He knew. Whatever was in there, it was enough to shake the walls of the room that haunted them both. Traore looked toward the entrance of the tent. "You'll leave tonight, quietly. My men will escort you to a hidden base, far from here. No phones, no signals, just safety." Johnny hesitated. "What if they track me anyway?" Traore locked eyes with him. "They won't." Johnny stood up slowly, the weight in his chest lighter now, but the fear still there. "Thank you," he said softly. Traore replied, "Don't thank me. This isn't about you or me. This is about what they've done and what they're about to do." The fire flickered harder again, and in that flicker, Johnny saw something in Traore's eyes. Not anger, not pride, but resolve. Something unshakable. Traore walked to the side of the tent and opened a drawer hidden beneath a table. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was an old phone, one that couldn't be traced, couldn't be hacked. He handed it to Johnny. "If something happens to me before this ends, call the number saved inside. Don't speak. Just let it ring. Help will come." Johnny took the phone, nodded slowly, and slipped it into his coat. The two men stood there for a moment, quiet, locked in an unspoken promise. Then Traore turned away and whispered almost to himself. This time, they whispered to the wrong man. 3 hours later, the convoy moved through the desert. No lights, no signal, no words. Just 3 black vehicles making their way across endless sand. Johnny sat in the back of the middle truck, staring out into the darkness. But his mind wasn't in the desert anymore. It was in that tent. In the silence, after he had whispered the truth he had never spoken before. He replayed the moment again and again. The look in Traore's eyes, the speed at which he stood, the calm, deadly focus. Johnny knew that look. It was the look of a man who had finally heard enough lies. But what scared Johnny now wasn't what they were running from. It was what Traore might be walking into. Back in the desert, the camp had gone quiet. Most tents had been packed. Most soldiers moved away from sight. But inside the main tent, Traore sat alone, laptop in front of him. The USB was in, the screen was playing, and what he saw shifted something inside him. It wasn't just one room. There were multiple, each colder than the last, each filled with familiar faces, famous faces, laughing, crying, some broken, some just numb. But one thing was the same in all of them, the watchers. Men in suits, smiling, unblinking, always watching. The footage ended with a name, a file, a location, a date. 1 week from now, Traore closed the laptop. Then he picked up the satellite phone. "Activate Protocol 31, he said. "Contact the journalist in Bamako, the one who disappeared last year. I want her safe. She's gonna publish everything." The voice on the other end hesitated. "Sir, that'll make you a direct target." Traore replied coldly, "I already am." Meanwhile, at the hidden base, Johnny finally arrived. It wasn't much, a small outpost buried in the rock, guarded only by a handful of loyal men. But it was safe. Safer than anywhere he'd been in months. He was led to a small room. Simple bed, wooden table, one window. As he sat down, the weight of it all finally settled. His body felt tired. His mind even more. But his soul, for the first time in years, didn't feel alone. He pulled out the photo of his son again and stared at it. "They won't find you," he whispered. "Not now. Not ever." Back in the capital, whispers were already spreading. Strange calls, disconnected numbers. One man reportedly left a meeting and never returned. Another, a lawyer close to a global NGO, found his entire digital footprint erased in under 3 minutes. And somewhere in Europe, the man Johnny had named, the one in the photo, received a single message on a phone that was supposed to be off-grid. The actor spoke. "The president moved. You're next." His hands trembled as he'd read it. Traore had become a storm, but not the kind that shouts, the kind that rises quietly and flips everything over without warning. A week passed. The room in Geneva was shut down. Cameras removed, walls repainted, and yet images had already leaked. Not through news, not through YouTube, through people. One image on a cracked phone, another on a hacked live stream, one voice memo from an unknown number. They never broke him, so now they fear him. Johnny stayed hidden. But one night, he received a call from that old untraceable phone Traore had given him. He picked up, didn't speak. Traore's voice came through. Calm, steady. "You were right," he said. "They only win if we stay quiet." Johnny replied, "Did it work?" There was a pause. Then, "Yes. And now they're the ones." Whispering. Click. The call ended. Johnny looked out the window into the open desert. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel empty. It felt clean. Something had shifted in the world. Not loud, not viral, but real. And somewhere deep in the silence, a secret had finally stopped being a burden. It had become a weapon. If this story made you pause, even for a moment, let it stay with you. Like, comment, and subscribe to stand with those who refuse to be silenced. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done if Johnny whispered that truth to you? The world doesn't always hear the truth, but it always changes when one broken voice decides to speak it.